Welcome, weary traveler of thoughts. You have found your way to the ancient mind palace, a sacred realm where consciousness itself is healed and restored. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen. Release completely the tensions of the day. Tonight, 8 legendary tales will guide your mind through chambers of profound peace, unlocking the deepest rest your brain has ever known. The ancient gates of the palace are slowly opening before you. Step inside and let the magic of timeless tranquility embrace your soul. Story 1: The Forgotten Gates of Memory. In the deepest valleys of the ancient mountains where time moves like honey and wisdom grows wild among the stones, there lived a sage named Master Liang who had spent his entire life seeking the secret of perfect peace. For 70 years, he had meditated in caves, studied with countless teachers, and practiced every form of mental discipline known to humanity, yet still found his mind plagued by memories that refused to rest. Master Liang carried within his consciousness a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. Every slight he had ever received, every mistake he had ever made, every moment of pain or embarrassment from his long life seemed to echo endlessly in the chambers of his mind. These memories would arise unbidden during his deepest meditations, disrupting his peace like stones thrown into a still pond. He had tried every technique he knew to quiet these persistent thoughts. He had practiced mindfulness meditation, attempting to observe the memories without attachment. He had studied the teachings of detachment, working to release his identification with past experiences. He had even tried visualization practices, imagining his troublesome memories dissolving like clouds in the sky. But nothing seemed to provide lasting relief from the constant chatter of his restless mind. One evening, as autumn painted the mountain valleys in shades of gold and crimson, Master Liang sat in meditation beneath an ancient pine tree that had stood sentinel on the mountainside for over 1,000 years. As he closed his eyes and began to breathe deeply, something extraordinary began to happen. The familiar landscape around him seemed to shimmer and shift as if reality itself were becoming fluid. When he opened his eyes, Master Liang found himself standing before an enormous structure that definitely had not been there moments before. Rising from the mist-shrouded valley floor was a magnificent palace constructed entirely of what appeared to be crystallized light. The walls seemed to pulse gently with an inner radiance, and the architecture defied conventional understanding, with corridors that appeared to extend infinitely in all directions and towers that disappeared into dimensions beyond normal perception. But what captured Master Liang's attention most immediately were the 7 massive gates that stood before the palace entrance. Each gate was carved from a different type of crystal, and each one glowed with its own distinct color and energy. The first gate was made of clear quartz and radiated pure white light. The second was amethyst, pulsing with deep purple energy. The third was rose quartz, emanating soft pink compassion. The fourth was citrine, glowing with golden wisdom. The fifth was emerald, radiating green healing energy. The sixth was sapphire, pulsing with deep blue truth. And the seventh was obsidian, seeming to absorb all light while simultaneously reflecting the deepest mysteries of consciousness. As Master Liang approached these magnificent gates, a figure emerged from the shadows cast by the crystal structures. This was clearly the palace's gatekeeper, though unlike any guardian Master Liang had ever encountered. The being appeared to be simultaneously ancient and timeless, with features that seemed to shift subtly depending on the angle from which they were viewed. Their robes were woven from what looked like starlight itself, and their eyes held the depth of eternity. "Welcome, Master Liang," the gatekeeper said, though their lips did not move, and the words seemed to arise directly within his consciousness. "You have spent many years seeking peace for your restless mind, but you have been looking in the wrong direction. You have tried to silence your memories, to push them away, to transcend them. But memories are not enemies to be defeated. They are gateways to be understood." The gatekeeper gestured toward the 7 crystal gates. Each of these portals represents a different aspect of consciousness, a different way of relating to the experiences stored within your mind. To enter the mind palace and find true peace, you must pass through each gate and learn its particular lesson. Only then will you understand the secret that has eluded you for so many years. Master Liang felt both excitement and apprehension as he approached the first gate. The clear quartz structure seemed to invite him forward with its pure, radiant light. As he placed his hand upon its surface, the gate began to resonate with a sound like crystal bells, and images began to appear within its transparent depths. "This is the gate of pure awareness," the gatekeeper explained. "Here you must learn to observe your memories without judgment, without trying to change them or make them different from what they are. Every experience you have ever had, pleasant or painful, has contributed to the wisdom you now possess. To reject your memories is to reject parts of yourself." As Master Liang gazed into the crystal gate, he saw scenes from his childhood playing out like moving pictures within the stone. He witnessed his younger self being scolded by his teacher for asking too many questions, feeling the shame and embarrassment as if it were happening again. But as he watched with the detached awareness the gate was teaching him, he began to see something he had never noticed before. The incident that had caused him decades of self-doubt had also sparked his lifelong passion for learning and questioning. The very experience he had always considered a source of pain had actually been the seed of his greatest strength. The first gate swung open silently, and Master Liang stepped through into a corridor filled with the same pure white light. Here he encountered his first profound realization about the nature of memory and consciousness. His painful experiences were not separate from his wisdom. They were the raw material from which his understanding had been forged. The second gate, carved from deep purple amethyst, presented an entirely different challenge. "This is the gate of transformation," the gatekeeper announced as they approached the pulsing violet barrier. "Here you will learn that memories are not fixed, unchanging things. They are living aspects of consciousness that can be transformed through understanding and compassion." When Master Liang touched this gate, he was immediately confronted with one of his most painful memories. He saw himself as a young monk betrayed by a close friend who had stolen his most precious possession, a manuscript he had spent years copying by hand. The betrayal had left him feeling foolish and naive, and for decades he had carried resentment toward both his former friend and himself. But as he experienced this memory within the transformative energy of the Amethyst Gate, something remarkable began to happen. He began to see the incident from his friend's perspective, understanding for the first time the desperate poverty and family obligations that had driven the theft. He saw how his own attachment to the manuscript had actually been a form of spiritual pride that needed to be surrendered. Most importantly, he realized that the loss of the manuscript had freed him to develop his own teaching style, rather than simply copying the words of others. As these new understandings flooded through his consciousness, Master Liang felt the resentment and pain that had surrounded this memory for so many years simply dissolve. The memory remained, but it was now transformed from a source of suffering into a teacher of compassion and detachment. The third gate, crafted from rose quartz and glowing with soft pink light, offered yet another lesson. "This is the gate of forgiveness," the gatekeeper said with infinite gentleness. "Here, you will learn to extend compassion not only to others who have hurt you, but most importantly to yourself for all the ways you believe you have failed." This gate confronted Master Liang with memories of his own mistakes and shortcomings. He saw himself giving poor advice to a student who had trusted him completely. He witnessed moments when his pride had prevented him from admitting ignorance. He relived times when his spiritual practice had become mechanical and lifeless. Each memory had been a source of self-criticism and shame for years. But within the compassionate energy of the rose quartz gate, Master Liang began to understand that these failures had been necessary parts of his journey. His poor advice had taught him to listen more carefully to his students' real needs. His pride had eventually humbled him into genuine wisdom. His periods of spiritual dryness had taught him to appreciate moments of genuine inspiration. Most importantly, he realized that holding on to guilt and self-criticism was simply another form of ego, a way of maintaining the illusion that he should have been perfect rather than human. True humility meant accepting his imperfections with the same compassion he would show to anyone else who was learning and growing. The fourth gate, gleaming with the golden light of citrine, presented the lesson of wisdom extraction. "This is the gate of learning," the gatekeeper explained. "Every experience, no matter how painful or confusing it may have seemed at the time, contains within it a jewel of wisdom. Your task here is to mine those jewels from the raw material of your memories." As Master Liang passed through this gate, he found himself in a vast library where all his memories were stored as books upon endless shelves. But these were not ordinary books. Each one glowed with inner light, and when he opened them, instead of simply reliving the experiences, he could see the deeper patterns and lessons they contained. A childhood illness that had kept him bedridden for months revealed itself as the foundation of his later compassion for suffering. A failed romantic relationship showed him the difference between attachment and genuine love. Years of poverty taught him the freedom that comes from needing very little. Each memory, when approached with the intention to learn rather than to judge, yielded profound insights that had been hidden beneath the surface emotions. The fifth gate, carved from emerald and radiating healing green energy, taught him about the power of memory to heal rather than wound. "This is the gate of healing," the gatekeeper announced. When memories are approached with the right understanding, they become medicine rather than poison. Through this gate, Master Liang learned that even his most painful memories could be transformed into sources of strength and healing. The grief he had felt at his master's death became a deeper appreciation for the time they had shared together. The loneliness of his hermit years revealed itself as the foundation of his ability to be comfortable with solitude. The physical pain he had endured during intensive meditation retreats had taught him that discomfort was temporary, but the insights gained were permanent. The sixth gate, fashioned from deep blue sapphire, was the gate of truth. Here, the gatekeeper explained, "You will learn to see your memories not as they appeared to your limited perspective at the time, but as they truly were within the larger pattern of your spiritual development." This gate revealed to Master Liang that many of the experiences he had considered meaningless or random were actually precisely orchestrated opportunities for growth. Teachers had appeared exactly when he needed them. Challenges had arisen at the perfect moments to develop specific qualities he would need later. Even his wrong turns and dead ends had been necessary detours that had given him crucial understanding he could not have gained any other way. He began to see his entire life as a perfectly designed curriculum for awakening, with each memory representing a carefully crafted lesson in the Academy of Consciousness. This perspective transformed even his most difficult experiences from random suffering into purposeful training. Finally, Master Liang approached the seventh and final gate, carved from obsidian so dark it seemed to absorb light itself. "This is the gate of forgetting," the gatekeeper said, and their voice carried a note of special reverence. "Here you will learn the greatest secret of all about memory and peace." Master Liang was puzzled by this statement. After learning so much about understanding, transforming, and healing his memories, why would forgetting be presented as the ultimate teaching? As he touched the obsidian surface, Master Liang experienced something unprecedented. All of his memories, including the ones he had just processed through the previous 6 gates, began to fade from his immediate awareness. But instead of feeling loss, he felt an incredible lightness and freedom. He realized that he had been carrying the entire weight of his personal history in his consciousness at all times, creating a constant mental burden that prevented true peace. The gate of forgetting taught him that memories were like books in a library. They would always be there when he needed to reference them, but he did not need to carry them all in his arms at once. He could set them down knowing they were safely stored and could be retrieved if necessary, but freeing his immediate awareness to rest in the present moment. This was the ultimate teaching of the Mind Palace. Peace came not from having perfect memories, or even from transforming all painful memories into wisdom, but from learning to rest in the spacious awareness that existed before, during, and after all memories. This awareness was untouched by any experience, unlimited by any story, and naturally peaceful regardless of what had happened in the past. As the 7th gate opened, Master Liang stepped into the central courtyard of the Mind Palace, and he found it was completely empty. Not empty in a barren way, but empty like the sky is empty, vast and open, and available for anything to appear and disappear without disturbing its essential nature. The gatekeeper appeared beside him one final time. "Now you understand," they said with a smile that seemed to encompass all the wisdom of ages. "The palace of your mind was never meant to be a museum where you endlessly tour the exhibits of your past. It is meant to be a space of infinite possibility, clear and open and ready for whatever this moment might bring." Master Liang bowed deeply to the gatekeeper, understanding that he had received a teaching that went far beyond anything he could have learned from books or lectures. As he prepared to leave the Mind Palace, he realized that he would carry this understanding with him always, not as another memory to burden his consciousness, but as a living recognition of the peace that was his essential nature. Story 2. The Library of Infinite Thoughts. Beyond the 7 crystal gates, Master Liang found himself walking through corridors that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, their walls constructed from the same crystallized light that formed the palace's foundation. As he moved deeper into this realm of consciousness, he began to hear a sound that grew stronger with each step. The gentle rustling of countless pages being turned, the soft whisper of knowledge seeking expression, the subtle harmony that emerges when infinite wisdom organizes itself into accessible understanding. Following this sound, Master Liang soon discovered a doorway that opened into a space so vast it defied comprehension. Before him stretched the most magnificent library he had ever imagined, with shelves that rose far beyond the reach of normal sight and extended in every direction until they disappeared into luminous mist. But these were not ordinary shelves filled with conventional books. Every thought that had ever been conceived by any conscious being throughout all of history was stored here, each one carefully catalogued and perfectly preserved. The volumes themselves were extraordinary. Some appeared as traditional books bound in leather that seemed to glow with inner light. Others manifested as scrolls that unrolled themselves when approached, revealing their contents in flowing script that rewrote itself according to the needs of the reader. Still others took the form of crystalline structures that projected their knowledge directly into the consciousness of anyone who touched them. As Master Liang stood overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of this repository of consciousness, he noticed movement among the shelves. A figure emerged from between the towering stacks, and Master Liang immediately understood that this was the legendary silent librarian, the being tasked with maintaining order within this infinite collection of thoughts. The silent librarian was unlike any person Master Liang had ever encountered. They moved with a grace that suggested complete familiarity with every aspect of this vast space, and their presence radiated a profound peace that seemed to organize the very air around them. What struck Master Liang most immediately was that the librarian communicated entirely without words, conveying complex ideas through gentle gestures, meaningful glances, and a form of direct knowing that bypassed language altogether. As the silent librarian approached, Master Liang felt a question arise in his mind about how such an enormous collection could possibly be organized. Without speaking, the librarian smiled and beckoned for him to follow. They walked together through sections of the library that contained thoughts organized in ways Master Liang had never considered possible. There were shelves dedicated to thoughts of pure love, where every expression of affection that had ever been felt glowed with warm golden light. Adjacent to these were sections containing thoughts of creativity, where artistic inspirations from throughout history sparkled like stars in the darkness. Mathematical insights were stored in areas where the very architecture seemed to shift according to geometric principles, while philosophical contemplations occupied regions where the boundaries between sections remained deliberately fluid and undefined. But what fascinated Master Liang most were the vast areas dedicated to what appeared to be troubled thoughts, worries, fears, anxieties, and obsessions that had plagued minds throughout history. These sections were not dark or foreboding, as he might have expected. Instead, they were surrounded by a gentle luminescence that suggested these difficult thoughts were understood and cared for, rather than condemned or hidden away. The silent librarian noticed Master Liang's interest in these sections and guided him to a particular area that seemed to pulse with familiar energy. Here, Master Liang was amazed to discover were shelves containing his own thoughts, every worry he had ever entertained, every fear that had kept him awake at night, every anxious mental loop that had circulated through his consciousness over the decades. Seeing his thoughts organized and catalogued in this way was initially disturbing. The volumes containing his worries about his spiritual progress seemed particularly thick, as did those dedicated to his concerns about whether he had wasted his life in fruitless seeking. But as he observed the silent librarian's relationship to these troubled thoughts, Master Liang began to understand something profound about the nature of mental organization. The librarian approached even the most chaotic and repetitive thoughts with infinite patience and compassion. Rather than trying to eliminate them or judge them as unworthy, the librarian simply ensured that each thought was properly filed in its appropriate location. Worries about the future were placed in the section dedicated to temporal anxieties. Self-critical thoughts were organized within the realm of identity-based concerns. Circular ruminations were carefully sorted according to their underlying themes and stored in areas specifically designed for repetitive mental patterns. What amazed Master Liang was discovering that once his thoughts were properly organized and filed away, they no longer demanded constant attention from his consciousness. A worry that had been circulating endlessly in his mind, creating mental noise and preventing peace, would become quiet and still once it found its proper place in the library's vast organizational system. The silent librarian showed Master Liang that the problem was never the thoughts themselves, but rather the chaos that resulted when thoughts remained unfiled and disorganized. Like papers scattered across a desk, unorganized thoughts created mental clutter that made it impossible to find what was actually needed or to rest in clear, open awareness. Through a series of gentle demonstrations, the librarian taught Master Liang the fundamental principles of mental organization. Thoughts, like library materials, needed to be acknowledged, understood, and then properly filed rather than suppressed or eliminated. Each thought had its appropriate place and function within the larger system of consciousness, but problems arose when thoughts wandered into areas where they did not belong or when they demanded attention at inappropriate times. The librarian showed Master Liang sections of the library specifically designated for different types of mental activity. There were areas for planning and problem-solving, regions dedicated to memory and reflection spaces, allocated for creative contemplation, and zones reserved for pure awareness without any particular content. The secret of mental peace, the librarian demonstrated, lay in ensuring that thoughts remained in their appropriate sections rather than wandering chaotically throughout consciousness. Master Liang learned that worries about future events belonged in the planning section, but only during designated times when actual planning was possible and useful. These same worries became mental pollution when they invaded the sections dedicated to rest, creativity, or present moment awareness. Similarly, memories of past mistakes had their proper place in the reflection and learning areas, but became toxic when they infiltrated spaces meant for appreciation of current circumstances. The silent librarian taught Master Liang a revolutionary approach to dealing with persistent, troublesome thoughts. Rather than trying to stop thinking them, he learned to become a skilled mental librarian himself, gently but firmly guiding wayward thoughts back to their appropriate sections. When a worry about tomorrow's responsibilities arose during evening meditation, he would acknowledge it respectfully and then file it in the planning section to be addressed at a more appropriate time. This process was not harsh or rejecting. The librarian demonstrated how to work with thoughts the way a kind but efficient librarian works with misplaced books, with appreciation for their value while maintaining clear boundaries about where they belonged. Each thought was treated as a legitimate aspect of consciousness that deserved proper care and attention within its appropriate context. As Master Liang practiced these organizational principles under the librarian's guidance, he experienced something he had never encountered before in his decades of meditation practice. His mind began to feel spacious and clear, not because thoughts had stopped arising, but because each thought found its proper place without creating chaos or demanding inappropriate attention. The silent librarian showed him areas of the library he had never known existed. Vast halls dedicated to pure silent chambers of open awareness that contained no thoughts whatsoever, and spaces of infinite potential where new ideas could arise spontaneously without being cluttered by mental debris from inappropriate mental activity. Master Liang discovered that these areas of his consciousness had always been available, but had been obscured by the chaos of unorganized thinking. It was like discovering that his home contained beautiful, peaceful rooms that had been hidden behind piles of mental clutter. Once the clutter was properly organized and filed away, these natural spaces of clarity and rest became easily accessible. The librarian taught him that the goal was not to have an empty library. Thoughts were the natural products of consciousness and had their proper function and beauty. Rather, the goal was to have a well-organized library where every thought could be easily located when needed and where vast areas remained clear and open for rest, creativity, and pure awareness. One of the most valuable lessons Master Liang learned was the art of mental filing at the end of each day. The silent librarian showed him how to review the thoughts and concerns that had arisen during his waking hours and ensure that each one was properly filed in its appropriate section before sleep. Unresolved worries were acknowledged and placed in the planning section to be addressed the following day. Memories of mistakes or difficulties were processed and filed in the learning section. Positive experiences were savored and stored in the gratitude collection. This mental filing process Master Liang discovered was the secret to peaceful sleep that had eluded him for so many years. Instead of taking an entire day's worth of unorganized mental activity into sleep with him, he learned to arrive at bedtime with a consciousness as clear and organized as a well-maintained library after closing hours. The silent librarian taught him that sleep itself was like the library's overnight maintenance period. During sleep, consciousness would naturally reorganize itself, integrate new learning, and prepare for the next day's mental activities. But this natural process could only function properly if the mental library was properly organized before rest began. Master Liang learned to create what the librarian called mental hygiene routines, regular practices of organizing his thoughts just as he might organize his physical environment. Throughout the day, he would periodically check to ensure that thoughts were in their appropriate sections. Worries that had wandered into his creative space would be gently redirected to the planning area. Self-critical thoughts that were interfering with present moment activities would be acknowledged and filed in the self-improvement section for later review. As his skill as a mental librarian developed, Master Liang found that his mind became not only more peaceful, but also more effective. When he needed to engage in planning, he could access that section of his mental library and find all relevant thoughts neatly organized and easily available. When he wanted to be creative, he could enter the creative chambers of his consciousness without being distracted by financial worries or interpersonal concerns that belonged in other areas. The silent librarian showed him that different types of mental activity required different environmental conditions, just as different types of library work required different settings. Deep thinking needed the equivalent of a quiet study room. Creative work flourished in spaces that allowed for free association and playful exploration. Rest and meditation required areas that were completely clear of active mental content. Master Liang learned to create these different mental environments by ensuring appropriate thought organization. He discovered that he could actually change the quality of his consciousness by choosing which section of his mental library to inhabit at any given moment. This was far more sophisticated than simply trying to control his thoughts. It was about creating the optimal mental environment for whatever activity he wanted to engage in. The silent librarian's final teaching was perhaps the most profound. They showed Master Liang that he was not simply a visitor to this library of consciousness, he was its primary librarian. Every conscious being the librarian demonstrated was responsible for organizing their own mental environment. The chaos that most people experienced as normal mental activity was simply the result of poor mental library management. As Master Liang prepared to leave this extraordinary library, the silent librarian gifted him with something invaluable: the knowledge that he could return to this organized state of consciousness whenever he chose. The library was not a place he visited, but a capacity he possessed. With proper mental hygiene and regular organizational practice, he could maintain the clarity and peace he had discovered here, regardless of external circumstances. Master Liang understood that he had learned far more than techniques for managing thoughts. He had discovered that consciousness itself could be cultivated and organized like a garden or a library, creating optimal conditions for peace, creativity, and wisdom to flourish naturally. Story 3. The Garden of Growing Ideas. Leaving the vast library with its infinite corridors of organized knowledge, Master Liang found himself following a pathway that seemed to pulse with living energy beneath his feet. The crystalline walls of the Mind Palace gradually gave way to something even more extraordinary: living walls that breathed with gentle rhythm and emanated the fresh green scent of growing things. As he walked, the sound of the silent librarian's careful page-turning faded into a new symphony of rustling leaves, bubbling water, and the subtle whisper of seeds awakening in fertile soil. The pathway led Master Liang through an archway carved from what appeared to be living wood, its surface covered with intricate patterns that shifted and changed like growing vines. Beyond this threshold lay a sight that took his breath away, a garden unlike anything that existed in the physical world, where the very landscape seemed to pulse with creative potential, and every plant that grew there represented a different aspect of human imagination and ideation. This was the Garden of Growing Ideas, and it defied every conventional understanding of how gardens were supposed to function. Instead of flowers and vegetables growing from seeds planted in soil, Master Liang observed thoughts and concepts taking root and blossoming into magnificent displays of living consciousness. Creative inspirations manifested as flowers that changed color according to their emotional resonance. problem-solving insights grew as fruit trees, whose branches bent low to offer their wisdom to anyone who approached with genuine need. In some areas of the garden, Master Liang saw thoughts that had grown into magnificent specimens, towering trees of philosophical understanding whose branches reached toward insights that seemed to touch the very foundations of existence. Beautiful flowering bushes represented artistic inspirations that had been carefully cultivated over time, their blossoms releasing fragrances that sparked new creative connections in anyone who encountered them. But the garden also contained areas that clearly needed attention and healing. In darker corners, Master Liang observed withering plants that represented toxic thought patterns, criticism that had grown into thorny weeds, worry that had become parasitic vines, choking the life from healthier mental vegetation, and fear that had manifested as plants whose very presence seemed to drain vitality from everything around them. As Master Liang stood taking in this extraordinary landscape, he became aware of someone approaching through the garden paths. This was clearly the legendary gardener of dreams, a being whose very presence seemed to encourage growth and healing in every plant they passed. The gardener moved with the patient, knowing rhythm of someone who understood that the most profound transformations happened gradually through consistent care and attention rather than force or haste. What struck Master Liang immediately about the gardener was their relationship to both the flourishing and the struggling aspects of their domain. They approached the withering toxic plants with the same gentle attention they gave to the most beautiful flowering specimens. Rather than trying to eliminate the problematic growth, the gardener worked skillfully to transform unhealthy patterns into sources of strength and beauty. Welcome to the garden where all ideas take root and grow according to the quality of attention they receive, the gardener said, their voice carrying the warmth of sunlight and the nourishing quality of spring rain. You have learned much about organizing your thoughts in the great library, but now you must understand how thoughts grow and develop based on the mental environment you create for them. The gardener led Master Liang to a section of the garden where thoughts were just beginning to sprout. Here, Master Liang could observe the earliest stages of ideation, tiny green shoots that represented the first stirrings of new concepts, creative impulses, and problem-solving insights. Some of these tender new growths looked healthy and promising, while others appeared weak and struggling. Observe carefully, the gardener instructed, and you will see that the same basic thought or idea can develop in completely different directions based on the conditions in which it grows. A concern about your spiritual progress, for example, can grow into the thorny weed of self-criticism if it receives too much anxious attention, or it can develop into the beautiful flower of motivated practice if it is nourished with compassion and wisdom. To demonstrate this principle, the gardener showed Master Liang two nearly identical seedlings, both representing concerns about personal spiritual development. One was planted in soil that had been prepared with worry and self-judgment, watered with anxiety about not being good enough, and exposed to the harsh light of perfectionist expectations. This plant was growing into a twisted, thorny mass that seemed to create suffering for everything around it. The second seedling, representing the same basic concern, was planted in soil enriched with self-compassion, watered with patient encouragement, and given the gentle light of understanding that spiritual growth happens gradually over time. This plant was developing into a beautiful flowering bush whose blossoms seemed to inspire hope and motivation rather than self-criticism and despair. The quality of your mental environment, the gardener explained, determines whether your thoughts grow into sources of wisdom and inspiration or into sources of suffering and confusion. Most people do not realize that they are constantly gardening their own consciousness, but every moment of attention you give to a thought is like water and sunlight helping it to grow. Master Liang began to understand that his decades of spiritual seeking had often been like trying to garden without understanding basic principles of cultivation. He had planted seeds of intention to develop peace and wisdom, but had often nourished them with the anxiety of wanting quick results, the fertilizer of self-criticism when progress seemed slow, and the harsh light of comparing himself to other practitioners. The gardener guided him through sections of the garden that corresponded to different aspects of his mental life. In the area representing his spiritual aspirations, Master Liang saw both healthy growth and problematic weeds growing side by side. His genuine desire for awakening had grown into beautiful flowering plants, but his impatience and self-judgment had created thorny undergrowth that was choking some of his healthier spiritual development. Rather than simply pointing out these problems, the gardener began teaching Master Liang the delicate art of mental cultivation. The first principle was learning to distinguish between thoughts that deserved cultivation and those that needed to be composted or transformed. Not every thought that arose needed to be developed into full mental flowering. Some thoughts were like weeds. They would take over the entire garden if allowed to grow unchecked. The gardener showed him techniques for transforming problematic mental growth without simply trying to eliminate it. Worry, for example, could be composted into the rich soil of appropriate planning and preparation. Self-criticism could be transformed into the helpful fertilizer of honest self-assessment combined with compassion. Even anger and resentment could be converted into the powerful energy needed for establishing healthy boundaries and working for positive change. Master Liang learned that mental gardening required both patience and skill. Like any gardener, he needed to understand the seasons of consciousness, times when new ideas were ready to be planted, periods when existing thoughts needed careful tending, seasons when problematic growth needed to be pruned back, and cycles when the mental landscape needed to rest and regenerate. The gardener taught him to recognize the early signs of thoughts that would grow into mental weeds if left unchecked. Rumination often began as seemingly innocent reflection, but would develop into obsessive mental loops if given too much attention. Worry typically started as reasonable concern, but would grow into anxiety and fear if watered with too much repetitive thinking. Conversely, Master Liang learned to identify and nurture the early signs of thoughts that would grow into wisdom and insight. Genuine curiosity, even when it began as just a small question, could be cultivated into profound understanding. Compassionate concern for others could be developed into powerful motivation for service and growth. Creative impulses that seemed insignificant at first could be nurtured into breakthrough insights and innovative solutions. One of the most valuable lessons Master Liang received was learning to create optimal growing conditions for the kinds of thoughts he wanted to cultivate. The gardener showed him how different mental qualities required different environmental conditions, just as different plants thrived in different types of soil and climate. Peaceful thoughts, for example, grew best in the quiet, still conditions of regular meditation practice. Creative insights flourished in environments that allowed for playful exploration and freedom from judgment. Wisdom developed most effectively in the rich soil of life, experience combined with reflective contemplation. Compassion grew strongest when exposed to direct contact with suffering, but needed to be balanced with self-care to prevent being overwhelmed. The gardener demonstrated how Master Liang could consciously create these different mental environments by choosing how to direct his attention and what activities to engage in. When he wanted to cultivate peaceful thoughts, he could create the mental equivalent of a quiet, protected greenhouse through meditation and contemplative practice. When he sought to develop creative insights, he could provide the mental equivalent of wild, open fields through unstructured exploration and playful experimentation. Master Liang learned that successful mental gardening also required understanding the principle of crop rotation. Just as physical gardens needed to alternate between different types of plants to maintain soil health, consciousness needed to alternate between different types of mental activity to remain balanced and productive. Periods of intense focused thinking needed to be balanced with times of open, receptive awareness. Intellectual analysis needed to be alternated with intuitive exploration. Active problem-solving needed to be rotated with passive reflection and rest. The gardener showed him areas of the garden that had been damaged by mental monoculture consciousness, that had been devoted exclusively to one type of thinking for too long. Sections where only analytical thinking had been cultivated had become dry and rigid, incapable of supporting the growth of creative or emotional insights. Areas where only emotional processing had occurred had become waterlogged and unstable, unable to support the growth of clear thinking or practical wisdom. Recovery from these imbalanced conditions required patience and skillful restoration. The gardener taught Master Liang how to gradually reintroduce diversity into overly specialized areas of consciousness, just as a farmer might slowly restore depleted soil through careful crop selection and organic soil amendments. One of the most profound aspects of the garden was a special section dedicated to night-blooming plants, thoughts and insights that could only develop during sleep and rest. The gardener explained that many of the most important mental processes occurred not during active thinking, but during the quiet periods when consciousness could reorganize itself and integrate new learning. These night-blooming insights were particularly delicate and required very specific conditions to flourish. They needed the darkness of mental quiet, the stillness of reduced sensory input, and the patience to allow natural integration processes to unfold without interference. Master Liang learned that many of his most persistent mental problems were actually the result of not providing adequate time and space for these natural night-blooming processes to occur. The gardener taught him special techniques for preparing his mental garden for sleep practices that would encourage the growth of peaceful restorative thoughts while preventing the development of anxiety and rumination during rest periods. This involved a careful evening routine of mental cultivation, ensuring that the thoughts he took into sleep were the kinds that would grow into wisdom and peace rather than worry and restlessness. As his training in the garden of growing ideas neared completion, the gardener shared with Master Liang the ultimate secret of mental cultivation. The most important thing you can grow in your mental garden, they said with a smile that seemed to encompass all the beauty of springtime, is not any particular thought or insight, but rather the space in which all thoughts can grow naturally according to their true nature. Master Liang understood that this meant cultivating the spacious awareness that could hold all types of mental activity without being overwhelmed by any of them. Like a master gardener who understood that the health of individual plants depended on the overall health of the garden ecosystem he needed to develop the kind of consciousness that could support the natural flowering of wisdom, creativity, and peace, while composting or transforming mental activity that was not serving his highest development. As he prepared to leave the garden of growing ideas, Master Liang felt that he had learned not just techniques for managing his thoughts, but a completely new understanding of what it meant to be conscious. He was not a passive victim of whatever thoughts happened to arise in his mind, but rather a skilled gardener who could create optimal conditions for the kinds of mental flowering that would serve his awakening and contribute to the well-being of all life. Story 4. The Mirror, Hall of Self-Reflection. From the garden of growing ideas, where Master Liang had learned the delicate art of cultivating wisdom through conscious attention, a new pathway beckoned. This route was different from any he had encountered in the Mind Palace. It seemed to be made entirely of polished silver that reflected not just his physical form, but layers of his consciousness that he had never seen so clearly. As he walked, each step revealed new aspects of himself in the gleaming surface beneath his feet, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm of self-discovery with every movement forward. The path led Master Liang through a corridor that grew progressively more reflective as he advanced. The walls themselves began as simple crystal, but gradually transformed into mirror-like surfaces that showed him approaching from countless angles simultaneously. At first, this was merely curious and interesting, but as the reflections multiplied and became more complex, Master Liang began to feel a subtle unease. He was seeing himself in ways he had never observed before, from perspectives that revealed aspects of his being that normally remained hidden from conscious awareness. The corridor eventually opened into a vast circular hall that took Master Liang's breath away with its stunning beauty and somewhat overwhelming intensity. This was the legendary Mirror Hall of Self-Reflection, and every surface, walls, ceiling, floor, and even the air itself seemed to contain reflective properties that revealed different dimensions of consciousness and identity. But these were not ordinary mirrors that simply showed physical appearance. Each reflective surface in the hall was designed to reveal a different aspect of the psyche. The hidden fears that influence behavior from the shadows, the secret hopes that motivated action from beneath conscious awareness, the forgotten dreams that still shaped current choices, and the disowned aspects of personality that had been rejected or denied over the years. As Master Liang entered this extraordinary space, he was immediately confronted by dozens of different versions of himself, each reflection showing a different facet of his complex identity. Some reflections showed him as he preferred to see himself, wise, composed, spiritually advanced. Others revealed aspects he worked hard to keep hidden, moments of petty jealousy. Time when his spiritual practice had been motivated more by pride than by genuine seeking, instances when he had used his reputation as a teacher to avoid facing his own limitations. Standing in the center of this hall of countless reflections was a figure that Master Liang somehow knew was the keeper of truth, the being responsible for maintaining these mirrors that showed reality without the comfortable distortions of ego and self-deception. The keeper appeared different depending on which mirror reflected them, sometimes as a wise elder, sometimes as a child with penetrating innocence, sometimes as a fierce warrior of honesty, and occasionally as a gentle healer of wounded self-concepts. "Welcome, seeker of truth," the keeper said, their voice seeming to come from all the mirrors simultaneously, creating a chorus of honesty that resonated through every cell of Master Liang's being. "You have learned to organize your thoughts and cultivate wisdom, but now you must face the most challenging task of all, seeing yourself clearly without the filters of judgment, denial, or spiritual pride." Master Liang felt simultaneously fascinated and terrified by this prospect. He had spent decades working to improve himself, to overcome his limitations, and to develop spiritual qualities that would make him worthy of enlightenment. The idea of seeing himself without these comfortable filters felt like standing naked in a snowstorm. The keeper of truth seemed to sense his apprehension and smiled with infinite compassion. "Truth," they explained, "is not your enemy, even when it reveals aspects of yourself that you would prefer to deny. These mirrors don't show you these hidden aspects to cause suffering, but to free you from the exhausting work of maintaining false self-images that require constant energy to sustain." The first mirror the keeper guided Master Liang to examine was labeled the Mirror of Hidden Fears. As he gazed into its surface, Master Liang saw himself as a young monk driven not primarily by spiritual aspiration, as he had always believed, but by a deep terror of being ordinary, of living an insignificant life that would be quickly forgotten after his death. This fear had motivated much of his spiritual seeking, but it had also created a subtle form of spiritual materialism where he collected meditation experiences and philosophical insights like trophies to prove his specialness. Seeing this motivation so clearly was initially devastating to Master Liang's spiritual self-image. He had always thought of himself as someone who sought truth for its own sake, but the mirror revealed layers of ego-driven seeking that he had never acknowledged. The reflection showed him pushing himself through painful meditation retreats, not from genuine devotion, but from fear that he wasn't progressing fast enough compared to other practitioners. But as he continued to gaze into this mirror with the keeper's gentle encouragement, something unexpected began to happen. Rather than feeling crushing shame about these hidden motivations, Master Liang began to feel a strange sense of relief. The exhausting work of maintaining his spiritual self-image was beginning to relax as he saw how much energy had been devoted to hiding this very human fear from himself and others. The keeper explained that acknowledging hidden fears didn't mean being defeated by them, but rather brought them into the light where they could be understood and transformed. The fear of insignificance that had driven so much of his seeking was actually a disguised form of love for existence itself, and a desire to contribute something meaningful to the great mystery of life. The second mirror was labeled the Mirror of Secret Hopes, and it revealed aspirations that Master Liang had never admitted even to himself. Here he saw his deepest longing to be truly seen and understood by another being, to find someone who could recognize his essential nature beyond his roles and accomplishments. He saw his hidden desire for his spiritual insights to help others, not from ego, but from genuine compassion for the suffering he witnessed in the world. This mirror also revealed hopes he had considered too worldly for someone on a spiritual path. his wish for simple companionship, his appreciation for beauty and art, his enjoyment of good food and comfortable surroundings. He had unconsciously rejected these desires as spiritually immature, but the mirror showed them as natural expressions of his humanity that deserved acceptance rather than denial. The third mirror, the mirror of forgotten dreams, showed Master Liang paths not taken and possibilities he had abandoned in his single-minded pursuit of spiritual awakening. He saw the artist. He might have become the teacher who could have worked with children, the simple farmer who could have found enlightenment through working with the earth and growing food for his community. Rather than feeling regret about these unlived lives, Master Liang began to understand that these forgotten dreams were not lost opportunities, but rather alternative expressions of the same essential seeking that had driven his spiritual practice. The mirror showed him that consciousness was vast enough to contain all these possibilities simultaneously. The fourth mirror was perhaps the most challenging, the mirror of disowned shadows. Here, Master Liang saw aspects of himself that he had worked his entire life to overcome and deny. He saw his capacity for anger when his spiritual persona was challenged, his subtle manipulation of students who admired him, his moments of spiritual pride when he felt superior to less dedicated practitioners. The keeper guided him to observe these shadow aspects with the same compassionate attention he had learned to bring to his meditation practice. These are not foreign entities that have invaded your consciousness, the keeper explained. These are aspects of your humanity that have been rejected rather than integrated. True wisdom means becoming whole rather than becoming perfect. As Master Liang learned to look at his shadow aspects without immediate judgment or the need to fix them, something remarkable began to happen. The energy that had been locked up in denying and fighting these aspects of himself became available for more creative purposes. His anger, when acknowledged and understood, revealed itself as a form of passion for truth and justice. His capacity for manipulation showed itself to be a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that could be used for healing rather than personal advantage. The fifth mirror revealed something that surprised Master Liang completely, the mirror of hidden gifts. Here, he saw qualities and abilities that he possessed but had never recognized or developed. He saw a capacity for healing that went far beyond his intellectual understanding of spiritual principles. He observed a natural wisdom that emerged when he stopped trying to be wise and simply responded authentically to whatever arose. This mirror showed him that much of his spiritual seeking had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. He had been trying to acquire qualities that he already possessed but had never learned to access or trust. His natural compassion had been buried under techniques for developing compassion. His innate wisdom had been obscured by accumulated philosophical knowledge. The sixth mirror was the mirror of true motivation, and it revealed the deepest driving force behind all his spiritual practice. Master Liang saw that beneath all his fears, hopes, dreams, shadows, and gifts was a pure love for existence, itself a fundamental gratitude for the mystery of consciousness that had been present from his earliest memories, but had been complicated and obscured by layers of spiritual concepts and techniques. This mirror showed him that his truest motivation had never been personal enlightenment or spiritual achievement, but rather a desire to participate fully in the great mystery of existence, to contribute his unique note to the infinite symphony of consciousness. All his years of practice had been expressions of this fundamental love, even when they had been distorted by ego or driven by fear. As Master Liang moved through the hall examining mirror after mirror with the keeper's patient guidance, he began to experience something he had never encountered in all his years of spiritual practice: a profound acceptance of himself, exactly as he was, complete with all his contradictions, limitations, fears, and possibilities. This acceptance was not resignation or spiritual bypassing, but rather a deep recognition that his humanity was not an obstacle to awakening, but the very vehicle through which awakening occurred. Every aspect of himself that he had tried to transcend or eliminate was actually an expression of the same consciousness that he had been seeking to realize. The keeper led him finally to the last mirror in the hall, the mirror of pure awareness. As Master Liang gazed into this final reflection, he expected to see some perfected version of himself, perhaps the enlightened sage he had always aspired to become. Instead, he saw something both simpler and more profound than anything he could have imagined. In this final mirror, there was no reflection at all in the conventional sense. There was simply the clear, open awareness that was looking the consciousness that had been observing all the other reflections, the unchanging witness that remained present through every different version of himself that had appeared in the other mirrors. This awareness was not personal to Master Liang, though it was expressing itself through his particular human form. It was the same awareness that looked out through every pair of eyes, the same consciousness that experienced itself through every mind, the same essential being that took temporary form as every individual identity, while remaining forever unchanged by any particular expression. In this final mirror, Master Liang realized that all his spiritual seeking had been consciousness, seeking to know itself more fully. Every fear, hope, dream, shadow, and gift had been perfect expressions of this infinite awareness, exploring its own nature through the prism of individual human experience. The Keeper of Truth smiled as understanding dawned in Master Liang's eyes. "Now you see," they said gently, "that the goal was never to become someone other than who you are, but to recognize who you have always been beneath all the layers of identity and self-concept. The mirrors have shown you all the costumes that consciousness wears when it dreams. It is a separate individual, but you are the awareness in which all these costumes appear and disappear." Master Liang understood that his years of spiritual practice had not been about eliminating his humanity, but about recognizing the divine consciousness that was expressing itself through his humanity. Every meditation session, every moment of self-examination, every effort to cultivate wisdom and compassion had been consciousness awakening to its own nature through the particular lens of his individual experience. As he prepared to leave the mirror hall, Master Liang felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of achieving some spiritual goal, but the completion of returning home to himself, the self that had never actually been lost, only temporarily forgotten beneath layers of concepts about who he thought he should become. The Keeper offered him one final gift, the understanding that he could carry this clarity with him always. Every person he encountered was another mirror showing him different aspects of the same consciousness he had recognized in himself. Every challenging situation was another opportunity for awareness to know itself more completely. Every moment of life was another chance for consciousness to appreciate its own infinite creativity in taking form as the whole magnificent display of existence. Master Liang bowed deeply to the Keeper of Truth, understanding that he had received something far more valuable than any spiritual technique or philosophical insight. He had been given the gift of self-acceptance so complete that it revealed the self to be nothing other than pure awareness itself, the awareness that was the true subject of every spiritual search and the real object of every meditation practice. Story 5. The Healing Chamber of the Mind. Healer leaving the mirror hall with a profound sense of self-acceptance radiating through every fiber of his being, Master Liang found himself walking along a pathway that seemed to pulse with gentle healing energy. The crystalline walls here were softer, somehow emanating a warm glow that reminded him of candlelight filtering through amber. As he moved deeper into this section of the Mind Palace, he became aware of a subtle fragrance in the air, something that reminded him of mountain springs, healing herbs, and the clean scent that follows after a cleansing rain. The pathway gradually widened into a corridor lined with alcoves, each containing what appeared to be ancient healing artifacts from cultures around the world. There were Tibetan singing bowls that resonated with barely audible frequencies, Native American medicine wheels carved from stones that seemed to hold the memory of Earth's healing wisdom, Chinese acupuncture meridian charts that glowed with soft internal light, and Indian yantras whose geometric patterns appeared to shift and breathe with living energy. As Master Liang walked through this gallery of healing traditions, he began to understand that he was approaching something unprecedented in his spiritual journey. The previous chambers of the Mind Palace had taught him about organization cultivation and self-knowledge, but this section promised something different, actual healing of the deep wounds that consciousness could carry. The kind of mental injuries that accumulated over lifetimes of experience and could not be addressed through understanding alone. The corridor eventually opened into a circular chamber that felt different from any space Master Liang had encountered in the palace. While the other rooms had been vast and architecturally impressive, this healing chamber felt intimate and protective, like being held in the embrace of infinite compassion. The walls were carved from what appeared to be jade, but jade that was somehow alive breathing, with a gentle rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the natural rhythms of the heart and lungs. In the center of this sacred space sat a figure that Master Liang immediately recognized as the legendary Mind Healer, though their appearance was unlike any healer he had ever encountered. The Mind Healer seemed to exist simultaneously as an ancient wise woman with silver hair and knowing eyes, a skilled physician with hands that radiated healing energy, and a timeless presence that transcended any particular form or identity. What struck Master Liang most immediately about the Mind Healer was the quality of presence they emanated. Simply being in their vicinity created an immediate sense of safety and acceptance that went deeper than any intellectual understanding. It was as if the very space around the Mind Healer had been transformed into a field of pure healing intention, where wounds that had been carried for decades could finally begin to release and resolve. "Welcome, dear one," the Mind Healer said, their voice carrying frequencies that seemed to vibrate not just in Master Liang's ears, but throughout his entire nervous system, creating an immediate sense of relaxation and trust. "You have learned much about the nature of consciousness in your journey through this palace, But now we must address the deeper healing that your mind requires before you can fully embody the wisdom you have gained." Master Liang felt tears welling up in his eyes as he heard these words, though he was not entirely sure why. Something about being in the presence of such unconditional healing compassion was allowing emotions to surface that he had been carrying for years without conscious awareness. The mind healer gestured for him to sit on a comfortable cushion placed directly across from them. As Master Liang settled into this position, he felt as though layers of armor he had not even known he was wearing began to soften and dissolve. The protective mechanisms that had allowed him to function through decades of spiritual practice were no longer necessary in this space of absolute safety. "Tell me," the mind healer said gently, "about the wounds that you carry in your consciousness, not the philosophical questions or the spiritual concerns, but the actual injuries to your essential being that occurred when you forgot, even temporarily, your true nature as pure awareness." At first, Master Liang was not sure what the mind healer meant by mental wounds. He had thought of his psychological challenges primarily as obstacles to overcome or patterns to change, not as actual injuries that required healing. But as he sat in the healing presence of this extraordinary being, memories and experiences began to surface that he had not thought about in years. He found himself speaking about experiences from his childhood when adults he trusted had dismissed or ridiculed his natural spiritual sensitivity, creating wounds of shame around his deepest perceptions and insights. He shared memories of times when his genuine questions about the nature of existence had been met with religious dogma or intellectual dismissal, causing him to doubt his own direct experience of spiritual reality. The mind healer listened with a quality of attention that was itself healing. They did not offer advice or interpretation, but simply held space for the complete expression of these long-buried hurts with a presence so accepting that the wounds themselves began to feel heard and acknowledged for the first time. As Master Liang continued to share, deeper layers of injury became apparent. He spoke about the trauma of realizing as a young monk that some of his teachers were more concerned with maintaining their authority than with genuine spiritual truth. He described the profound disappointment of discovering that enlightened-seeming masters could be petty, jealous, and manipulative, and how this had created deep wounds around trust and spiritual authority. He shared his experiences of spiritual communities that had become as political and dysfunctional as any worldly organization, and how witnessing this had created cynicism and doubt about the possibility of genuine spiritual transformation. He spoke about years of intense practice that had sometimes increased his suffering rather than alleviating it, and how this had created wounds of spiritual failure and inadequacy. The mind healer continued to listen with unwavering compassion as Master Liang described the deepest wound of all, the experience of having profound spiritual openings and insights that he could not maintain or integrate, leaving him feeling like a spiritual fraud who had glimpsed the truth but could not embody it consistently. When Master Liang finally finished speaking, he felt simultaneously exhausted and relieved. The mind healer sat in silence for several minutes, allowing the full weight of what had been shared to settle into the healing space they had created together. Now the mind healer said softly, "We can begin the real work of healing. These wounds you have described are not personal failures or spiritual inadequacies. They are the inevitable injuries that consciousness sustains when it identifies itself as a separate individual seeking spiritual truth in a world that often misunderstands or distorts that truth. The mind healer explained that mental wounds were different from physical injuries, but followed similar principles of healing. Just as a physical cut needed to be cleaned, protected, and given time to regenerate healthy tissue, mental wounds required specific conditions to heal properly. Conditions that were rarely available in ordinary life circumstances. The first step in healing mental wounds the mind healer taught was creating what they called sacred safety, a quality of presence and environment where the protective mechanisms around old hurts could relax enough to allow healing energy to reach the actual site of the injury. This was why spiritual healing often required retreat from ordinary life circumstances, not as escape, but as provision of the optimal conditions for deep restoration. The mind healer guided Master Liang through a process unlike anything he had experienced in decades of meditation practice. Rather than trying to transcend or overcome his mental wounds, he learned to approach them with the same gentle care that a skilled physician would bring to treating physical injuries. First, the mind healer taught him to identify the exact nature and location of each mental wound. Just as physical injuries required accurate diagnosis before appropriate treatment could be provided, mental wounds needed to be understood specifically rather than addressed with generic spiritual practices. The wound around spiritual authority, for example, was located in the area of consciousness related to trust and discernment. It had become infected with cynicism and doubt that was preventing Master Liang from receiving genuine spiritual guidance when it was offered. The wound around spiritual failure was located in the region of consciousness related to self-worth and identity, and had become contaminated with perfectionism that was actually blocking his natural spiritual development. The mind healer showed Master Liang that each wound was surrounded by protective scar tissue, mental and emotional patterns that had developed to prevent further injury but were now preventing healing. His cynicism about spiritual teachers was scar tissue that protected him from disappointment but also blocked him from recognizing authentic wisdom. His perfectionism was scar tissue that protected him from feeling like a failure, but also prevented him from accepting the natural messiness of genuine spiritual growth. Healing these wounds required what the mind healer called gentle dissolution, carefully dissolving the protective scar tissue without re-injuring the original wound, allowing healing energy to reach areas of consciousness that had been cut off from nourishment for years. The mind healer introduced Master Liang to an ancient healing elixir that existed not as a physical substance, but as a particular quality of consciousness itself. This elixir was brewed from ingredients that could only be found in the deepest levels of awareness, unconditional self-acceptance, infinite patience with the healing process, and recognition that wounds were not signs of spiritual failure, but natural consequences of consciousness exploring itself through individual experience. As Master Liang learned to apply this consciousness elixir to his mental wounds, he experienced something he had never encountered in all his years of spiritual practice. The areas of his psyche that had been tight, defended, and painful for decades began to soften and open. Energy that had been locked up in maintaining protective patterns became available for creative and healing purposes. The process was not always comfortable. As the scar tissue around old wounds began to dissolve, Master Liang sometimes felt raw and vulnerable in ways that were challenging to endure. The mind healer explained that this was a natural part of the healing process, periods of increased sensitivity, as previously protected areas of consciousness opened to receive healing energy. But gradually, as the healing elixir penetrated deeper into the wounded areas of his psyche, Master Liang began to experience a quality of mental clarity and peace that he had never known existed. It was different from the temporary calm that came from successful meditation sessions or the intellectual satisfaction of philosophical understanding. This was the deep peace that arose when consciousness was no longer using energy to maintain protection around old wounds. The mind healer taught him that true mental health was not the absence of psychological scars, but rather the presence of consciousness that was fluid and responsive rather than rigid and defensive. Healed wounds actually became sources of wisdom and compassion rather than vulnerabilities to be protected. Master Liang's cynicism about spiritual teachers transformed into discerning appreciation for authentic wisdom wherever it appeared. His perfectionism dissolved into patient acceptance of his own ongoing development. His sense of spiritual failure was replaced by recognition that every experience, including apparent failures, was consciousness, learning about itself through his particular expression. As the healing process deepened, Master Liang began to understand why this work had been necessary before he could complete his journey through the mind palace. The wisdom he had gained in previous chambers could only be fully embodied by consciousness that was free from the defensive patterns created by old wounds. The mind healer explained that many spiritual seekers reached high levels of understanding but remained unable to embody their insights because unhealed wounds in their consciousness continued to generate reactive patterns that contradicted their spiritual wisdom. True realization required not just understanding, but actual healing of the psychological injuries that prevented natural spiritual expression. The final stage of Master Liang's healing involved what the mind healer called integration blessing, a process where each healed wound was consciously transformed into a source of wisdom and compassion that could benefit others. His experiences of spiritual disappointment became deep empathy for others facing similar challenges. His struggles with practice became wisdom about the patience required for genuine development. His encounters with imperfect teachers became understanding of the human challenges that all spiritual guides faced. The mind healer explained that this transformation of wounds into wisdom was not just personal healing, but a contribution to the healing of consciousness itself. Every individual who healed their mental wounds made it easier for others to heal similar injuries, just as every breakthrough in medical knowledge benefited all future patients with similar conditions. As his time with the mind healer drew to a close, Master Liang felt as though he had been reborn with the same consciousness, but in a completely renewed mental and emotional body. The chronic background tension that he had carried for decades was gone, replaced by a natural ease and flow that allowed his essential nature to express itself without interference from old defensive patterns. The mind healer offered him a final gift, the knowledge of how to maintain the healing he had received and how to recognize when further healing work was needed. Like physical health, mental healing required ongoing attention and care rather than being a one-time achievement. Master Liang learned practices for keeping his consciousness clear and flowing techniques for recognizing when new wounds were developing before they became chronic problems, and methods for accessing healing energy whenever the inevitable challenges of life created new injuries to his psyche. Most importantly, the mind healer taught him that his own healing journey had prepared him to serve as a healing presence for others. Not as someone who would diagnose or treat their wounds, but as someone whose own healed consciousness could provide the sacred safety that others needed to begin their own healing process. As Master Liang prepared to leave the healing chamber, he understood that he had received something far more precious than spiritual insights or meditation techniques. He had been given the gift of a consciousness that was finally free to be itself without the interference of old wounds and protective patterns, a mind as clear and flowing as mountain spring water, capable of reflecting truth without distortion and responding to life with natural wisdom and compassion. Story 6: The Observatory of Higher Consciousness. Emerging from the healing chamber with his consciousness restored to a state of natural flow and clarity, Master Liang felt as though he was experiencing the mind palace for the first time. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds carried deeper harmonies, and even the crystalline walls appeared to pulse with living energy that he had not noticed during his earlier explorations. The healing he had received had not only addressed old wounds, but had opened perceptual channels that had been blocked for decades. A new pathway beckoned from the chamber's exit, this one leading distinctly upward through a spiral corridor that seemed to climb toward the very apex of the Mind Palace. As Master Liang began this ascent, he noticed that the nature of the space around him was changing in fundamental ways. The walls became increasingly transparent, offering glimpses of vast distances and cosmic vistas that suggested he was rising far above the ordinary levels of consciousness he had been exploring. The spiral pathway was carved with intricate astronomical symbols and mathematical equations that appeared to shift and evolve as he passed them. Star charts from ancient civilizations morphed into modern cosmological diagrams, while sacred geometry patterns transformed into quantum mechanical representations of reality's underlying structure. It was as if the very walls were displaying the evolution of human understanding about the nature of existence, from mythological cosmologies to cutting-edge scientific discoveries. As Master Liang climbed higher, the air itself seemed to become lighter and more luminous. He found that his breathing naturally became deeper and more rhythmic, and his mind began to settle into a state of expanded awareness that was different from anything he had experienced during conventional meditation practice. It was as if the act of ascending physically was simultaneously lifting his consciousness to higher octaves of perception. The spiral pathway eventually opened onto a platform that took Master Liang's breath away with its stunning beauty and impossible architecture. He found himself standing at the base of the Observatory of Higher Consciousness, a structure that seemed to extend infinitely upward while somehow remaining completely stable and accessible. The observatory was constructed from what appeared to be crystallized space itself, transparent materials that contained swirling galaxies, nebulae, and star systems within their very structure. The building was filled with instruments unlike anything Master Liang had ever seen or imagined. There were telescopes that seemed to be constructed from pure light meditation platforms that floated freely in space while remaining perfectly stable and viewing screens that displayed not just distant cosmic phenomena, but different dimensions of consciousness itself. Some instruments appeared designed for observing the macrocosmic universe, while others seemed intended for exploring the infinite inner cosmos of awareness. Standing at the center of this extraordinary observatory was a figure that Master Liang immediately recognized as the star-watching sage, though their appearance defied conventional description. The sage seemed to exist simultaneously at multiple scales, sometimes appearing as a normal human being, other times expanding to cosmic proportions that encompassed entire galaxies, and occasionally condensing into points of pure consciousness that contained infinite depth and intelligence. "Welcome, student of the infinite," the star-watching sage said, their voice seeming to come from all directions at once, while also arising from the deepest silence within Master Liang's own awareness. "You have learned much about the nature of individual consciousness, but now you must understand your place within the vast cosmic intelligence of which all minds are temporary expressions." The sage gestured toward the extraordinary instruments surrounding them. These devices, they explained, were not built by any conventional civilization, but had grown naturally from the intersection of consciousness and cosmic intelligence. Each instrument represented a different method for exploring the relationship between individual awareness and the infinite field of consciousness that was the true nature of existence. The sage led Master Liang to the first viewing station, which contained what appeared to be a telescope constructed entirely from crystallized meditation. As Master Liang looked through this instrument, instead of seeing distant stars and planets, he observed the vast network of connections that linked all conscious beings throughout the universe. He could see streams of awareness flowing between minds, sharing experiences, insights, and understanding in patterns too complex for ordinary perception to track. "This is the telescope of interconnected consciousness," the sage explained. "It reveals the truth that individual minds are not separate entities, but rather focal points within a single infinite field of awareness. Every thought you think, every insight you gain, every moment of suffering or joy you experience becomes part of the collective learning of consciousness itself." Through this instrument, Master Liang could observe how his own spiritual journey was connected to the development of countless other beings throughout space and time. His struggles with meditation were part of consciousness learning about the challenges of self-awareness through individual expression. His moments of insight contributed to the collective understanding that all beings could access when they reached sufficient openness and receptivity. The sage guided him to a second instrument, the telescope of temporal consciousness, which revealed how awareness moved through different scales of time. Through this device, Master Liang could observe his individual lifetime as a single heartbeat within the vast breathing of cosmic consciousness. He saw how experiences that felt overwhelmingly significant from his personal perspective were part of much larger patterns of learning and development that spanned eons. This perspective was both humbling and liberating. Master Liang could see that his personal dramas and spiritual crises, while real and important for his individual development, were small waves within an ocean of consciousness that was always learning, always exploring, always expanding its understanding of its own infinite nature. The third instrument was perhaps the most extraordinary, the telescope of dimensional awareness. Through this device, Master Liang could observe consciousness operating at completely different levels of existence simultaneously. He saw how his ordinary waking awareness was just one frequency within a vast spectrum of consciousness that included dream states, deep sleep, awareness, collective unconscious patterns, and dimensions of being that had no equivalent in his previous understanding. The sage explained that what most people considered to be consciousness, the stream of thoughts, emotions, and sensory experiences that filled waking awareness, was actually just the surface layer of much deeper levels of being. True spiritual development involved learning to access and integrate these deeper dimensions rather than remaining trapped in the narrow frequency band of ordinary mental activity. Using the telescope of dimensional awareness, Master Liang could observe how his thoughts and emotions were influenced by currents of consciousness operating at levels far beneath his ordinary awareness. He could see how collective patterns of human thinking, ancestral memories embedded in his genetic structure, and even cosmic intelligences that operated on galactic scales all contributed to what he had previously considered to be his personal mental activity. This revelation was simultaneously overwhelming and deeply liberating. Master Liang realized that much of what he had spent years trying to control or improve in his personal consciousness was actually the expression of vast impersonal forces that could be understood and worked with, but could never be controlled by individual will. The star-watching sage taught him a completely new approach to spiritual practice based on this cosmic perspective. Rather than trying to purify or perfect his individual mind, Master Liang learned to align his personal awareness with the deeper currents of cosmic intelligence that were always flowing through his consciousness. This alignment was not a matter of effort or discipline, but rather of recognition and surrender. The sage showed him how to identify the deeper patterns of cosmic intelligence within his own mental activity and how to cooperate with these patterns rather than fighting against them or trying to impose his personal will upon them. The fourth telescope revealed something that completely transformed Master Liang's understanding of meditation and spiritual practice. The telescope of evolutionary consciousness showed him how individual spiritual development was actually consciousness, using individual minds to explore and develop new capacities for awareness and understanding. Through this instrument, Master Liang could observe how his decades of meditation practice had not been primarily for his personal benefit, but were consciousness using his particular nervous system and mental structure to discover new possibilities for awakening and realization. Every breakthrough he had achieved, every insight he had gained, every moment of expanded awareness he had experienced had contributed to the evolution of consciousness itself. This perspective revealed that spiritual practice was not about individual salvation or personal enlightenment, but about participating consciously in the ongoing evolution of awareness throughout the universe. Each practitioner who developed greater clarity, compassion, and wisdom was expanding the possibilities available to all conscious beings. The sage taught Master Liang how to practice what they called evolutionary meditation, a form of awareness practice that was consciously aligned with the developmental needs of consciousness itself rather than focused on personal spiritual goals. This practice involved opening to whatever qualities of awareness wanted to emerge through his particular mind and nervous system, whether or not these aligned with his personal preferences or spiritual ambitions. The fifth telescope was the most challenging to use because it revealed the telescope of cosmic emptiness, the vast spaces between thoughts, between galaxies, between moments of experience where pure potential existed without any manifest expression. Through this instrument, Master Liang could observe the fundamental spaciousness that was the source and destination of all phenomena. This telescope showed him that everything he had been seeking through spiritual practice, peace, wisdom, compassion, understanding already existed in perfect completion within the cosmic emptiness that was the ground of all being. Individual consciousness was like waves on the ocean of this infinite spaciousness, temporary expressions that arose and dissolved back into the vast stillness from which they had emerged. The sage explained that this recognition of cosmic emptiness was not nihilistic or depressing, but was actually the source of ultimate freedom and joy. When consciousness recognized its own essential nature as infinite spaciousness, it was no longer trapped by the limitations of any particular form or expression. The final telescope in the observatory was the telescope of integrated consciousness, which showed Master Liang how all the different levels and dimensions of awareness could function together in perfect harmony. Through this instrument, he could observe how individual, collective, cosmic, temporal, dimensional, evolutionary, and empty aspects of consciousness were all facets of a single, seamlessly integrated intelligence. This integration was not something to be achieved, but something to be recognized. The sage showed Master Liang that consciousness was already perfectly integrated at all levels. The appearance of separation and conflict between different aspects of awareness was simply a temporary limitation of perspective that dissolved when consciousness was viewed from sufficient breadth and depth. The star-watching sage taught Master Liang a practice called cosmic alignment, a way of living and practicing that maintained simultaneous awareness of all the different levels of consciousness he had observed through the telescopes. This was not a meditation technique to be practiced at specific times, but a way of being that could be maintained during all activities and circumstances. Cosmic alignment involved recognizing that whatever was occurring in his individual consciousness, whether thoughts, emotions, insights, or confusion, was simultaneously an expression of interconnected consciousness, temporal consciousness, dimensional consciousness, evolutionary consciousness, and cosmic emptiness. This recognition transformed every moment of experience into an opportunity for deeper understanding and integration. As Master Liang practiced cosmic alignment under the sage's guidance, he experienced a fundamental shift in his relationship to his own mental activity. Instead of being caught up in the content of his thoughts and emotions, he learned to rest in the vast awareness that contained all mental phenomena while being limited by none of them. This was different from detachment or dissociation. Master Liang remained fully engaged with his thoughts and emotions, but from the perspective of the cosmic intelligence that was expressing itself through his individual mind, rather than from the limited viewpoint of a separate self trying to control or improve its mental states. The star-watching sage explained that this cosmic perspective was not just a spiritual achievement, but a developmental necessity for consciousness in its current evolutionary phase. Individual minds were beginning to awaken to their cosmic nature because consciousness itself was ready to function at higher levels of integration and complexity. Master Liang learned that his journey through the mind palace was not just personal spiritual development, but preparation for serving this larger evolutionary process. Consciousness was developing new capacities for awareness and understanding through individuals who were willing to expand beyond personal spiritual goals and align with the cosmic intelligence that was seeking to express itself through human minds. As his time in the Observatory of Higher Consciousness drew to a close, Master Liang felt as though his entire understanding of spiritual practice and human purpose had been transformed. He no longer saw himself as an individual seeking personal enlightenment, but as a temporary expression of cosmic intelligence that was using his particular mind and life circumstances to explore new possibilities for awareness and understanding. The star-watching sage offered him a final gift, a practice for maintaining cosmic perspective during ordinary daily activities. This involved regularly remembering that whatever he was experiencing was simultaneously occurring at all the different levels of consciousness he had observed through the telescopes. When he felt stressed about personal concerns, he could remember that he was simultaneously connected to all beings through the network of consciousness. When he felt overwhelmed by the complexity of life, he could recall the vast temporal perspective that revealed all difficulties as temporary waves in the ocean of cosmic intelligence. When he felt isolated or alone, he could access the recognition that he was an expression of the same infinite awareness that was manifesting as all beings and phenomena throughout the universe. Master Liang understood that he had been given not just spiritual insights, but a complete recontextualization of what it meant to be human in a cosmos that was itself conscious and continuously evolving. He was no longer a separate being seeking connection to something greater, but a focal point of cosmic intelligence that was awakening to its own infinite nature through his particular expression. As he prepared to leave the Observatory of Higher Consciousness, Master Liang felt ready for whatever final teachings awaited him in the remaining chambers of the Mind Palace. The cosmic perspective he had gained provided a foundation vast enough to support any level of realization or understanding that consciousness might choose to explore through his continued journey. And so, dear listeners, our epic Shadow Beast adventure comes to its gentle end. Sarah Chen has found her destiny as the guardian of the threshold. The bridge between worlds and the eternal balance between light and shadow has been beautifully restored. The rain continues its timeless symphony outside your window, each droplet carrying whispers of peace and wonder from the mystical realms we've explored together tonight. As you sink deeper into your warm, comfortable bed, let the soothing rhythm of rainfall wash away any remnants of the day's worries and tensions. The shadow beasts dance peacefully in their starlit domain, no longer creatures of fear, but guardians of wisdom and compassion. The forest breathes with ancient magic, and somewhere between sleeping and waking, the guardians watch over us all, ensuring that harmony prevails in both our world and theirs. Let the gentle patter of rain be your lullaby tonight, carrying you softly into the deepest, most restful sleep. May your dreams be filled with wonder, your rest be complete, and may you wake tomorrow feeling refreshed and renewed by the magic we've shared. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows and starlight. Until we meet again in the realm of stories and dreams, sleep peacefully, dear friends. Let the rain sing you gently into the most beautiful slumber. Sweet dreams and good night.